Hello, it's October 2025. Complicating the uncomplicated. It's a phrase that I coined many years ago. And it really began with people talking about philosophy. And that's a really good example of complicating the uncomplicated. Now, philosophy in its origins, way back before it became something that people studied with seriousness, it was meant to be a tool to be used to get people to think. For example, to think outside of the box, not to think linear. Just to expand a little bit, perhaps to inspire new ideas or so forth. I'll give you kind of a parallel example. When people talk about if a tree falls and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And people have discussed this and debated this to nauseam for decades, perhaps even longer, failing to understand the origins of that was to have people think, not to be used literally. Because of this, we have people talking about this world being some sort of like video game simulation and all this other stuff, and how, just kind of expanding on all these silly tangents. But complicating the uncomplicated. Now, I'm just going to segue for a brief moment when I say how liberalism has infected even the most conservative types. And this, complicating the uncomplicated, is a good example of that. Because where you see, for example, libertarians having a million shades of gray on any particular topic, and there's no absolute, there's no right or wrong, etc., this complicates the uncomplicated. Because there cannot be one truth, one fact. There has to be many. And this creates division. Now, where we see this really taking hold, the topic of this video, is, for example, in politics, law. Let's use law as an example. How law has become so complex, and even with its formalities. Its formalities are basically just some sort of traditions. And you have people using law and complicating, for example, a case beyond what it should be. You have the facts, you have the evidence. And now this does not mean anything or linked anything to, for example, Occam's razor, where, simply put, the simplest answer is probably the correct answer. That's something completely different, and there's people who, as a descriptive, debunk that whole concept. It's not necessarily seeking the simplest answer. It's seeking the factual answer. And sometimes a factual answer may have some complexities to it, some layers to it. But I don't want to discuss that. I've talked about this Occam's razor before in other older videos. But we see, for example, both Complicating and Uncomplicated, and I'm going to mention again just one more time, Occam's razor, these things are based on people's limited knowledge bases and their critical thinking skills, the level, to whatever degree that they have. And when we see, for example, with the courts, people complicate things. You have one side arguing, for example, whether it be a defense or on the prosecution side, or even with a lawsuit, you have two sides trying to make an argument, complicating things, bringing in case law and everything else, trying to pitch something to a judge. Now, the judge is not the court. Judges will say this court, but it's all make-believe. It's all nonsense. You have, for example, two advocates selling an idea to an individual, and that's all a judge is. One step above, for example, an advocate, say a lawyer or agent. And it's their personal opinions masquerading as some sort of court ruling that gets imposed that we hear. But everything gets complicated. Even rulings become complicated when it shouldn't be. We see this a lot in politics. We see this, for example, as well in social settings among, for example, the commoners. And people will talk about any particular topic to great lengths. And then we see, for example, this nonsense of, well, let's just agree to disagree. It's just a cop-out. That's all that is. It's useless. Now, there are some things that, like, for example, pineapple on pizza, which is not based on fact. It's just, for example, personal preference. Yes or no, pineapple on pizza. We have other things that are very clear-cut and dry. That this, for example, act happened. Was this said? Period. If you can prove it, then you have facts. But the pineapple on pizza type of argument and factual events kind of got into the same mixing pot. And this, what I'm talking about, leads to, for example, tyranny. And Complicating the Uncomplicated does tie in with, for example, implanting false memories, something that I've really focused on, the studies made famous by Julia Shaw. And we really see this, for example, with PSYOPs. And everyone's questioning everything. Say, for example, a major event, trying to use their limited knowledge base to try to understand what really happened. And we see, for example, a lot of content creators, a lot of influencers feeding this nonsense to people, where people are in the comment section just going off on all these tangents based on their biases, their belief systems, for example. And there's confusion, chaos. At one point, in what we're told history is anyway, things were not as confusing because things were not being complicated. For example, laws were very simple, to the point. That's it. It's not to say it was perfect, because again, as today, we see a lot of corruption within the justice system overall. And those who are enforcing, allegedly enforcing, the law. Now, people talk about, well, we need more laws. Well, you can write the most perfect law for something, but it's the individual called a judge who refers to him or herself as the court that interpret it. You have two individuals, advocates, lawyers, agents, whatever, arguing a position, and this is where things start to get complicated. Perhaps the lawmakers, when they were writing it, were, okay, this is pretty straightforward, here we go. But then the courts overall, keeping with that descriptive, bastardize it. Well, then we have to write more laws. And this segues into democracy. Democracy needs to have a large government. It has to grow. It has to micromanage. On contrast, a true republic has minimal government, minimal control. Because initially, governments were only ever meant to create and maintain infrastructure, but it grew into a monster we see today. People cry out for democracy. What they're really crying out for is tyranny. And I've highlighted over the years, even recently, how, for example, 51% of the people can take away the rights of 49%. Now, what if that 51% are completely insane? There's a problem. And we have serious problems today. People cry out for this democracy, not really knowing that democracy is socialism, etc. But we see how, going back to law, injustices happening all the time, daily. Wrongful convictions based on false accusations. Whether the false accusation is done by, from say, a commoner to a commoner, or by someone in an authoritative position, for example, like a police officer, there's a false accusation, we have wrongful convictions. And even if there's no individuals involved, say there's an event, well, people get wrongfully convicted because the system complicates it all to the point where someone can be convinced of a crime that didn't even happen. That's how crazy the world is. And what people are dealing with is this, everything becoming complicated. We see this, for example, a lot with social justice movements and people asking, well, what is a woman? What is a man? Complicating the uncomplicated, there's nothing absolute, there's nothing definite. No one can answer because all the different shades of gray that could possibly be. So these are examples of complicating the uncomplicated. The answer should be very straightforward. It's simple. It's called biology. And we see the social effects that that's had. And these things are politically driven. And when you set aside logic, for example, and you start going down this crazy, complex rabbit hole and imposing that, for example, as the will of the state, well, it's a downward spiral from there. What can you take away from all this? Well, don't complicate the uncomplicated. Don't buy into, for example, things like philosophy. Don't buy into liberal arts, theoretical pseudosciences. And there's another example of complicating and uncomplicated when we talk about the liberal arts, theoretical pseudoscience of psychology, again, complicating the uncomplicated. There's a part of all that when you study and understand behavior and patterns. But then there's the other half, which is just all made up nonsense. For example, diagnosing someone. And we see a lot of people who claim to be experts on body language or language itself and being some sort of expert. Well, for one thing, if you don't have a baseline on how the person acts or speaks normally, then that's out the window. And people do change due to, for example, circumstances in their own lives, just change because biology changes, whatever. So there's never a definite, but people will swear up and down, hey, they touched their nose. That's a sign of something, and usually something negative against them. Complicating the uncomplicated. Don't fall for these things. Just keep a level head. And knowledge, information is power. The more information you can take in, the less likely you're going to complicate the uncomplicated. Now you have to be careful of what information you're taking in. And you don't need 10,000 examples of something to say, yeah, look it. I've talked about this. Where you have both sides using a common descriptor, left and right, or whatever you want to call them, becoming consumed with all these rabbit holes. And I've dedicated a video talking about rabbit holes and everything else. Just be mindful when something sounds really complex, but don't be dismissive if something is complex. And when you look at, for example, my story in Calgary, Alberta, to some it's very complex and they're very dismissive. Then they will seek out something that's more comforting, that's more easy for them to grasp. But there's different layers, for example, to my story and how it all played out. But if you followed it from the beginning to as a lucid script at the end, it makes sense. That's all I really want to say. Don't complicate the uncomplicated. Things to think about. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share.